Picture this. The Emperor of Rome, Nero, drapes a bridal veil over the face of a boy he had castrated. The boy's name was Sporus. The empire watched as Nero married him in public, called him Empress, took him to bed. They said it was love, but it wasn't. It was grief. It was madness. It was power, sinking its claws into a young, helpless body and calling it devotion. This is not a story about forbidden romance. This is the story of a child turned into a doll, of a mind broken, a soul erased, and a body used to fill a void that could never be filled. Today, we tell the true story of Sporus, the boy who was mutilated, dressed like a queen, and forced to live the lie of a love that was never his. We don't know when Sporus was born. We don't know who his parents were, and we'll never know what name he was given at birth, because Sporus wasn't a name. It was a nickname, a cruel one. In ancient Greek, sporos means seed, but to the Romans, it was something far more degrading, a word for a castrated boy. That's all we have. That's how he enters the record, already renamed, already reduced. He was likely born into slavery or servitude. No rank, no coin, no voice. Just another child growing up in the shadows of an empire too loud to hear soft cries. But something about him stood out. Ancient writers described Sporus as delicately beautiful, with a kind of youthful grace that turned heads and tragically made him a target. In a world where beauty could be currency, Sporus had value. But not the kind you wanted, not the kind that saved your life, the kind that painted a bullseye on your soul. He was barely a teenager when Emperor Nero noticed him. By then, Nero had already started to unravel. He had murdered his own mother, Agrippina. He had kicked his pregnant wife, Papaya, in the stomach until she died. And he was beginning to drift into a reality where pain and pleasure blurred, where power could be shaped into whatever fantasy he wanted. And what he wanted was to bring Papaya back. He missed her terribly. Historians argue whether it was guilt, madness, or genuine grief. But Nero's obsession grew like mold in his mind. He began searching for someone who looked like her, someone soft, someone pale, someone submissive. That's when he found Sporus. To Nero, Sporus wasn't a person. He was a blank canvas, an empty shape that could be dressed, trained, silenced, and sculpted into the wife he'd lost. A body to be rewritten. And so, history shifts. From this point on, Sporus is no longer referred to as a child, or a servant, or a boy. He becomes something else. Something trapped between categories. Not male, not fully female. Not citizen, not slave. Not even fully human in the eyes of those around him. He became Nero's project, his plaything, his fantasy, his mourning doll. Imagine being that child. Imagine waking up one day and being told you'd been chosen by the emperor. Not for protection, not for honor, but to become his dead wife. There is no account of what Sporus said. There are no letters, no journals, no protests etched into stone, because there was no one to listen. His silence wasn't choice, it was survival. Some modern scholars suggest that Sporus may have had no say at all. Castration in ancient Rome was illegal for citizens, but not for slaves or captives. And Nero was emperor, above every law. If he wanted to erase someone's manhood to satisfy his grief, no one would stop him. The Roman historian Suetonius notes that Nero castrated a boy named Sporus and tried to make him his wife. That's all. One sentence. Centuries of pain compressed into 10 words. What the text doesn't describe is the fear, the room, the hands holding him down, the flash of the blade, the wet heat of blood. It doesn't describe how a boy screamed into the marble halls of a palace too large to echo back. It doesn't describe what died in him that night, besides his body. By the time it was over, Sporus was no longer just a child. He was a symbol of something far more disturbing. How absolute power can turn grief into cruelty, and a human being into a living doll. This is where his story begins. Not in birth, but in erasure. Not with love, but with violence disguised as affection. Not with his voice, but with his silence. And as we move deeper into this nightmare, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to exist? When everything that made you, you, has been taken away, after Papaya died, Nero stopped sleeping. He wandered the marble corridors of his palace like a ghost. Some said he wept for days, others claimed he refused to eat. But what they all agreed on was this. Something inside Nero broke. Papaya had been many things to him: lover, empress, symbol of elegance and fertility. But above all, she was his possession. And now, she was gone. The guilt of her death. Some said it consumed him. Others said he didn't feel guilt at all. Just emptiness. The kind of emptiness that echoes. You see, Nero wasn't just grieving. He was unraveling. The Roman Empire at this point was still held together, barely, by ceremony and fear. And at the center of it all stood a man who thought himself a god. He played the lyre like Orpheus. He raced chariots like Apollo. He sang on stage, demanded applause, and made senators weep, not with policy, but with performance. And now, his favorite role was slipping away. The role of husband to Papaya. The tragedy, the mourning, the longing. It all began to ferment in his mind until it turned into something darker. He didn't want to move on. He wanted her back, so he searched. First, among the nobility, then the slaves, then the children. That's when he saw Sporus. He didn't see a boy. He didn't see a person. He saw a mirror. A fragile, glowing reflection of the woman he had lost. Sporus was young, delicate, wide-eyed, with pale skin and soft features. To Nero, it was uncanny. It wasn't resemblance. It was reincarnation. And once that idea took root, there was no turning back. He began whispering to his advisors. He began planning a wedding. He began calling Sporus by Papaya's name even before the mutilation took place. There's something especially grotesque about this kind of obsession. It wasn't lust, not in the traditional sense. It was grief weaponized. Love twisted into domination. Because Nero wasn't just trying to replace Papaya, he was trying to control her, even after death. This time, he wouldn't lose her. This time, she wouldn't talk back. This time, she'd be exactly what he wanted, forever. Let's be clear. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't about love. It was about status. It was about heirs. It was about politics. But Nero's plan broke every rule. He was going to marry a castrated boy and crown him Empress. Not in secret, not in whispers, in front of everyone. Historians have debated Nero's motives for centuries. Was he truly mad? Was this political theater? Was it punishment to shock the Senate? Or was it something simpler and more disturbing? Was it just loneliness? After killing his mother and his wife, Nero had few people left who could speak to him honestly. He had lovers, yes, servants, entertainers, but no one who loved him. So, instead of seeking love, he created an illusion of it, a silent, obedient replica of the woman he couldn't keep alive. And Sporus? He had no choice. There's no record of him resisting, no account of him trying to escape. But what could he have done? He was a teenager, a slave, a powerless body in the hands of the most powerful man in the world. Nero gave orders, and Rome obeyed. The wedding preparations began. A veil was sewn, jewels were gathered, a bridal gown was fitted, not for a woman, but for the echo of one. In the palace, servants began calling Sporus Papaya Augusta out loud, without flinching. And Sporus? He learned to smile, to bow, to survive. Because if he didn't, he'd vanish. Or worse. This wasn't just an obsession anymore. It was an official story. A rewriting of reality where death could be undone by sheer force of will, and a human body could be reshaped into memory. Nero didn't want comfort. He wanted control. He wanted resurrection, not of the soul, but of the image. And Sporus became the image. He became the living photograph of a woman long gone, the moving statue Nero paraded through his grief. No matter how he felt, no matter what he feared, Sporus could not say no. Because what Nero gave him wasn't a crown. It was a cage made of silk and gold. The madness of Nero wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was beautiful, terrifyingly beautiful, like a symphony played in a burning theater. And Sporus was center stage. At the height of this grotesque fantasy, Nero made a final decision. One that crossed every line, even for him. He would castrate the boy, not out of cruelty, not for punishment, but so Sporus could never grow into a man, so that Nero's bride would remain soft, feminine, silent, so that Papaya would never die again. That moment, the moment he decided to cut Sporus open, is the climax of the Emperor's obsession. Because in that moment, he wasn't just mourning. He was replacing. He was rewriting. He was playing God with flesh and blood. There was no warning, no ceremony, no official decree, no trial, only a decision and a blade. When Nero ordered the castration of Sporus, it wasn't written in law. It didn't need to be. He was the law. Historians like Suetonius mention it almost casually. He had a boy named Sporus castrated and tried to make a woman of him. That's it. No details, no outrage, just a fact. But history, when it's silent, is often hiding a scream. Castration in ancient Rome was technically illegal for free citizens. But Sporus wasn't free. He was either a slave or a servant, property in the eyes of the state. And property could be altered. We don't know where it happened. Maybe in a room deep in the palace, maybe in a medical chamber, though medicine in the 1st century CE was not what we imagine today. There was no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no sterilization. only iron tools and hope. Modern doctors say the risks of castration at a young age, especially in adolescence, are severe. Shock, hemorrhage, infection, lifelong hormonal damage. The body doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. But Sporus was not allowed to be a patient. He was a project, a canvas. To Nero, this wasn't surgery. It was sculpture. And the chisel was unforgiving. Let's speak honestly, but carefully. The procedure would have been brutal, a physical mutilation of the most intimate kind. But Nero didn't see it that way. To him, this was a gift, a transformation, a rebirth. He wasn't destroying Sporus. He was perfecting him. In his mind, he was turning a boy into a bride, creating a vessel for Papaya's spirit, filling the hole left by grief with a body he could shape, dress, command. Imagine the silence of that room. The cold stone beneath Sporus's back, the hands holding him still, the smell of oil and metal, the sharp hiss of a blade being warmed over flame. And then, pain. We don't know if Sporus screamed. But how could he not? Maybe his voice echoed down marble halls. Maybe it was smothered by cloth. Or maybe it never left his throat, trapped there like the rest of him. Afterward, he wouldn't have been able to walk for days. He would have bled. He would have trembled. There is no record of a physician tending to him. No record of comfort. Only whispers that he was bathed, dressed in silk, and presented to Nero within weeks. Because pain was not allowed to interrupt Nero's fantasy. And Sporus? He no longer fit into any category. Not a boy, not a man, not a woman, not a citizen. He became something Rome had no name for. A living statue carved by grief. And this is important to understand. What happened to Sporus was not a one-time injury. It was a lifelong sentence. The removal of his testes meant his body could not produce testosterone. His voice would never deepen. His bones would weaken with time. His body would remain soft, even as the world hardened around him. Modern endocrinologists confirm that castration before puberty leads to permanent physical and emotional effects. Heightened risk of osteoporosis, sterility, mood swings, depression, vulnerability to chronic illness. But Sporus didn't receive hormone treatment. He wasn't given therapy. He wasn't even allowed dignity. He was dressed in bridal robes and told to smile. And the worst part? The court applauded. When Sporus appeared in public after his transformation, the elite of Rome saw not horror, but novelty. They laughed. They whispered. Some even praised Nero for his artistry. Because cruelty, when performed with gold and silk, becomes spectacle. And Sporus was now part of the show. He was paraded alongside Nero in ceremonial processions. He was seated beside him at banquets, addressed as Lady Papaya. He was watched, admired, mocked, desired, but never seen for who he was. We will never know how Sporus felt. He left no diary, no letter, no grave marker with words of his own. But perhaps the truest account is what he did not do. He never tried to become powerful. He never tried to escape. He never tried to reclaim his identity, because there was no identity left. What Nero did to Sporus wasn't just physical, it was existential. He turned him into a vessel, empty, polished, controlled. A thing to be loved, so long as it didn't speak. A thing to be mourned, if it ever broke. The castration of Sporus is not just an act of violence. It is a turning point in the story of power itself. when grief becomes entitlement, when obsession becomes domination, when love becomes possession. And Sporus, the child, the person, faded, not all at once, but cut away piece by piece, until all that remained was a body dressed in memory. It happened in full view. No secrecy, no shame, no hesitation. In the most powerful city in the world, under the blazing Roman sun, Emperor Nero staged a wedding. And standing beside him, draped in veil and jewels, was a child, castrated, dressed, renamed. They called him Sporus, but that day, they called him Empress. The spectacle was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. It wasn't just a wedding, it was theater. And Nero was the star. He wore a ceremonial robe of purple and gold. A crown of laurels circled his perfumed curls, his face freshly powdered, his expression calm, radiant, almost divine. Next to him stood Sporus, wrapped in silks fit for a goddess. Historians describe it almost mockingly. Suetonius wrote that Nero married a boy, Sporus, in a public ceremony, complete with dowry and bridal veil, and called him his wife. But what that line doesn't tell you is how Rome responded. They watched. They clapped. They smiled nervously. Because when a man like Nero weds a castrated child in the Forum, you don't ask questions. You pretend it's normal. You play along, or you disappear. Sporus was handed gifts as if he were a bride of noble birth. Vases, rings, coins struck with his new face. His name, Papaya, was whispered through the crowd. But make no mistake, this wasn't a wedding. It was a resurrection. Nero wasn't marrying Sporus. He was marrying the memory of the woman he'd killed. And Sporus? He was the stand-in, the living altar upon which Nero rebuilt his fantasy. The ceremony had all the trappings of Roman formality: priests, oaths, trumpets, laughter, applause. But beneath the fanfare, the horror was plain, if you dared to see it. Because at the center of it all stood a boy without a voice, a boy with no say, no escape, no future, just silk and silence. After the vows were spoken, they rode together in a golden chariot. Citizens lined the streets. Some cheered, others stared, unsure whether they were witnessing a celebration or a warning. And Nero beamed. He waved like a triumphant general, one arm around his bride, the other raised toward the gods, as if seeking their blessing on this unholy union. That night, the palace glowed with torchlight. Tables overflowed with wine and roasted boar. Musicians played soft ballads once favored by Papaya. Slaves danced in masks of animals. Laughter echoed off marble. But Sporus did not laugh. He sat beside Nero, veiled and painted, his hands folded in his lap like a doll. And then came the night after the wedding, the night no historian dared to describe in full. We can only imagine the moment Sporus was led away, through a hallway of shadows, through doors carved with scenes of conquest, into the emperor's private chamber. We can only guess how cold the sheets felt, how heavy the silence hung, how Nero whispered her name, Papaya, over and over again. But it wasn't her. It was him. A boy with stitched flesh and trembling hands. A boy who once had a future, now asked to play dead. This wasn't love, it was ritual, the performance of desire with an audience of ghosts. Some ancient sources claim Nero even mimicked a full bridal procession, that he called on the Senate to acknowledge his new Empress, that he forced Sporus to appear at court in women's clothing from that day forward. And Rome obeyed. They dined beside him. They toasted to the marriage. They pretended, because pretending was safer than truth. But for Sporus, the pretending never stopped. Day after day, he was made to sit beside the man who destroyed him, smiling, nodding, bowing, a doll with porcelain skin and hollow eyes. At banquets, guests would raise their cups and say, "To the Emperor and his bride." And somewhere, in the quiet folds of Sporus's soul, a scream grew roots. But it never came out, because survival in Rome meant silence. There was no exit, no rebellion, no breaking free, only roles, and the cage of silk that held him there. The wedding of Sporus wasn't a union of two people. It was the victory of one man's madness over the humanity of another. It was the moment when grief became performance and violence became romance. And Sporus, he wasn't a spouse. He was a stage prop, a symbol, a mask. The body dressed up in someone else's ghost, a mirror Nero kissed to avoid facing the emptiness inside. And as Rome watched, no one stopped it. Because power like Nero's didn't need to ask permission. It only needed an audience. They called her the Empress. They bowed to her in the streets. They offered gifts at her feet. They adjusted their tone, their gaze, their language, just enough to stay alive. Because Nero wasn't playing a private game anymore. He had taken his delusion public. And so Sporus became a part of the empire's theater. He sat beside Nero at banquets, wearing flowing gowns embroidered with gold. He was adorned with pearls, powdered in white, his lips stained red. Every gesture rehearsed, every smile practiced. He appeared in public rituals, greeted ambassadors, walked the marble halls of palaces like a royal consort. But behind the silken ceremony, there was no power, only obedience. Sporus was no longer treated as a boy, or a servant, or even a man. He had become an object of transformation, a ghost built in silk. To the Roman elite, it was amusing. They laughed behind their hands. They whispered over wine. Some were disgusted, others fascinated. But all of them watched. Because how could they look away? A boy, castrated and dressed as a queen, paraded like an idol. This was something even Rome had never seen. He was beautiful, they said, eerily so, as if he had been painted, not born. And that was the point. Nero didn't want a partner. He wanted perfection, a figure untouched by time or defiance. So he reshaped Sporus day by day. He chose the robes. He chose the perfumes. He controlled the meals, the movements, the moments. Even Sporus's laugh was dictated. When to smile, when to glance, when to flutter lashes just enough to look imperial. But inside, Sporus was unraveling. You can only perform for so long before the mask fuses to your face. Psychologists today might call it dissociation, the mind retreating into silence to survive unbearable reality. But in the first century, there was no name for it, only the sensation, floating through life like a ghost in your own body. Sporus began to disappear from within, not loudly, not all at once, but in tiny pieces. Each time he was forced to play Empress in a room full of senators. Each time Nero kissed him in front of soldiers and servants. Each time someone called him Papaya and expected him to say, "Thank you." The mind cracks under that kind of pressure. He wasn't allowed to grieve the life he lost, because he was told this was a better one. He wasn't allowed to mourn his own name, because Nero had given him a new one. He wasn't allowed to speak of pain, because pain was part of the role. And so he did what many do in the face of trauma. He performed. He smiled at the right moments. He bowed when Nero entered. He listened quietly as poets sang about the beauty of Rome's Empress. He became so good at it that people began to believe the illusion. But it was just that, an illusion, held together by fear. Because Sporus knew one wrong word, one wrong glance, and the fantasy would crack, and with it, his life. There are stories, some half-whispers from ancient sources, that Nero would force Sporus to reenact scenes from his life with Papaya, that he would dress him in old garments, that he would speak to him in her voice, that he would call him wife in bed, in court, in public. And Sporus, he would nod, he would obey, because obedience meant survival, but survival has a cost. Over time, the boy who once had soft eyes and trembling hands began to lose even his reflection. He became truly a doll, not just to Nero, but to himself. In one recorded moment, a public banquet, Nero turned to Sporus in front of dozens of nobles and cracked a joke. The crowd laughed. Nero then gestured at Sporus, and Sporus laughed too. Not because he found it funny, not because he wanted to, but because Nero was watching, because the crowd was watching, because that was the role. And in that moment, with laughter echoing through the room, with gold light bouncing off polished floors, with wine staining white silk, Sporus smiled. But his eyes did not. They stared blankly into the distance, not focused on the present, but somewhere else, somewhere far where the noise couldn't reach. That image, Sporus laughing with dead eyes, became a symbol of something deeper. How empires don't always kill you with swords. Sometimes they kill you with roles. They hand you a mask and expect you to smile as they erase your name. Sporus had become the perfect creation of Roman power. Silent, elegant, broken, a body without resistance, a voice without truth, a soul wearing someone else's skin, and no one, not a single senator, servant, or soldier, reached out to pull him from the fire. Because as long as Nero's illusion remained intact, Rome would keep clapping. There's a kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It doesn't soothe. It doesn't comfort. It wraps around your mind like wet cloth, smothering, not protecting. That's the silence Sporus lived in. On the surface, nothing had changed. He still wore the robes. He still sat beside Nero. He still smiled on cue. But inside, something was breaking, not like a glass shattered in one sudden crash. More like a mirror cracking slowly, line by line, until the reflection no longer made sense. We have no diary, no letter, no whisper from Sporus himself. But trauma has its own language. It speaks through behavior. And by this point in his story, Sporus had stopped behaving like a person trying to survive. He had become someone simply trying to disappear without dying. Psychologists today might call it dissociation, when the mind can no longer reconcile reality with the pain of existing in it. You feel yourself float away. You watch your body from the outside. You obey because that's the only thing left to do. It's a strategy, not for living, but for enduring. And that's what Sporus was doing, enduring the slow collapse of identity. Imagine waking up each morning and being addressed as someone else, wearing clothes not of your choosing, sitting in rooms where every glance towards you is loaded with a lie. Over time, you forget what your own name sounds like. You forget the rhythm of your voice when it isn't mimicking someone else. You forget what it feels like to choose. This is what researchers call learned helplessness, a state in which a person, subjected to repeated trauma and stripped of control, no longer tries to escape even when escape is possible. Sporus wasn't just playing a role anymore. He had become trapped in it. Some say he began to speak less, that he avoided mirrors, that his eyes, once described as soft and expressive, grew vacant. Because in the palace, performance never ended. He had to laugh at jokes he didn't understand. He had to act grateful for attention he didn't want. He had to pretend he was alive, when in truth, he was sinking. We can imagine the moments alone, in a corridor, in a courtyard at dusk, behind a curtain between appearances. What did he feel then? Did he hum a tune Papaya once sang? Did he press his fingers to his own throat and wonder what voice was meant to come out? Did he remember being a boy, running barefoot across stone before the curtain was drawn over his life? Or had even that memory been replaced? There's something unspeakably cruel about the way Sporus was erased, because it wasn't violent in the usual sense. It wasn't a sword or a whip or a cage. It was subtle. It was repetition. It was the slow, daily swallowing of truth. It was a man whispering, "You are my wife," until the echo became louder than reality. The more Nero spoke, the smaller Sporus became. Until one day, the only person left to remember who he had been was himself. And even that was fading. Imagine a body dressed in splendor, walking through the palace gardens. Fragrant air, polished marble, rose petals drifting on water. And yet the figure moves like a ghost, not touching, not feeling, just repeating. That was Sporus, a soul caught between performance and punishment. He couldn't rebel, because rebellion requires belief that you deserve more. He couldn't run, because where would he go? He couldn't die, because Nero wouldn't let him. So he stayed. He lived, but he was not alive. And that's the darkest kind of fate, because death is final. But this was endless. And then came the moment, recorded only in fragments, when Sporus stood before a mirror. Not a grand one, not a ceremonial one, a simple one. A polished plate of bronze, perhaps, bent slightly, warped by time. And what he saw staring back was not himself, not the boy, not the servant, not even the Empress. Just a painted face, a smooth, silent mouth, eyes rimmed with shadow, a figure draped in someone else's grief. He reached out, maybe to touch, maybe to remember. But the glass didn't answer, because mirrors don't speak. They only reflect. And in that moment, Sporus understood something unspeakable. He had not just been hurt. He had been rewritten, not in blood, not in ink, but in silence. A kind so deep it drowns you slowly, while the world claps and calls it beauty. Rome was burning. But this time, not by Nero's hand. The year was 68 CE, and after years of cruelty, indulgence, and illusion, the walls of power began to crack. Rebellions flared across the provinces. Senators whispered. Generals turned their backs. The empire had grown tired of Nero's games, his songs, his races, his theater of grief. And in the end, even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, walked away. Alone in his palace, surrounded by statues and sycophants, Nero realized what he had refused to believe. The gods were no longer watching, and neither was Rome. He fled. Not with generals, not with gold, not with scrolls of command. He fled with a handful of loyal slaves, and with Sporus. Not his guards, not his ministers, his doll. Because in the deepest corners of Nero's madness, Sporus wasn't just a comfort. He was the last remnant of control. Everything else had betrayed him. But Sporus? Sporus had never spoken out, never broken character, never said no. And so, as Nero disguised himself in ragged robes and slipped into the night, he took Sporus by the hand. Imagine that scene. A former emperor, once draped in silk and gold, now hunched beneath a cloak, face hidden, voice hushed, eyes darting. And beside him, a boy in borrowed clothes, who once wore a wedding veil, now running through the mud like a shadow without a name. They fled to a villa outside the city, an abandoned house, cold and crumbling. No guards, no food, no future. And in that ruin, Nero wept. According to the historian Suetonius, he cried out, "What an artist dies in me, not what a leader, not what a man, an artist." Because even in his last days, Nero believed this was all a stage, that the world was his audience, that history was a script he could rewrite. And Sporus? Still beside him, still silent. What did he feel in those final hours? Did he hope Nero would be captured? Did he pray for freedom? Or had hope already rotted into numbness? We don't know. We only know what happened next. As Nero's pursuers closed in, he panicked. He begged one of his few remaining servants to kill him. None dared. Finally, with a borrowed dagger and the hands of a freedman guiding his own trembling fingers, Nero drove the blade into his throat. Blood gushed. He gasped. He died. And with him, the illusion died too. Rome did not weep. There were no songs, no poems, no tributes. The Senate declared him a public enemy. His statues were smashed, his name erased from monuments. The boy emperor, the singer of tragedies, the killer of mother and wife, was now just a body, rotting in a shallow grave outside the capital he once ruled. But Sporus? Sporus was not free. You might think the death of his abuser would mean escape. It didn't. Because Sporus was no longer a boy. He was no longer even a person in the eyes of those around him. He was a symbol, a novelty, a whisper of Nero's madness that Rome found too fascinating to let go. He was taken in by another man, Otho, one of Nero's former companions, and, disturbingly, the very general who briefly seized the throne next. And what did Otho do? He took Sporus as his own, just like Nero. The cycle didn't end. It just changed hands. Sporus was once again dressed in fine clothing, brought to banquets, called by a name that wasn't his. No one asked what he had suffered. No one asked who he really was. They only asked, wasn't that the one Nero married? Isn't that the boy who became a queen? Even in Nero's death, the performance went on. Because for Rome, Sporus had stopped being a person long ago. He was a curiosity now, a relic of an emperor's madness, a breathing rumor in a city of politics and power. And no one, not senators, not poets, not priests, thought to let him go. Because freedom was never part of the script, Nero was dead. But the curtain didn't fall. The empire staggered into chaos. 4 emperors in a single year, blood spilled across marble and sand. But in the ashes of that power struggle, Sporus remained. Not as a citizen, not as a victim, as a curiosity. He was passed from man to man, like a rare coin or an exotic pet. After Nero's suicide, Sporus was taken in by Otho, one of Nero's closest allies and lovers. Otho, like Nero, had known Sporus during the height of the imperial madness. And now, with Nero gone, he took the boy as his own. Not in mourning, not in pity, but in imitation. Because power, especially Roman power, has a way of recycling its cruelty. Otho paraded Sporus in public, dressed in imperial clothing. He referred to him as Empress. He used him at banquets to shock and impress senators, like an artifact come to life. And Sporus? He obeyed. Because by now he knew what resistance cost. Because by now he didn't know what else to be. Even as the faces changed around him, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, the role never did. He was the one who had been Nero's bride, the one who had been castrated for love, the one who had become a myth while still breathing. Cassius Dio wrote that Sporus continued to appear in public for years after Nero's death. Not as a man, not as a free citizen, but as a living reminder of a grotesque era. He wasn't granted retirement. He wasn't granted silence. He was dragged onto the stage again and again, always expected to smile, until one day, it went too far. It was under the rule of Vitellius, a brutish, gluttonous general who briefly held the throne during Rome's year of the 4 emperors. Vitellius, according to multiple sources, planned a grand spectacle for his court, a satirical reenactment of Nero's wedding. The idea? Have Sporus dress once again in bridal attire, march him through a mock procession, force him to relive the ceremony that had once erased him. Only this time, it wouldn't be called a marriage. It would be a joke. The court would laugh, the generals would drink, and the boy who had survived the unimaginable would be made to perform his own trauma for entertainment. That was the final crack. That was the line he could not cross again. Because this time, there was no Nero to please. No illusion of grief, no mask of romance. It was pure humiliation, nothing more. And for Sporus, who had endured silence, obedience, violence, performance, that was enough. He made his choice. He did not wait for the day of the spectacle. He did not appear in a gown. He did not speak another line. Instead, he found a quiet place, and he took his own life. Some sources say he slit his wrists. Others suggest poison. The details have been lost. But the result was the same. Sporus, castrated, renamed, rebranded, and paraded, died as he had lived, unheard. No grave remains, no monument, no inscription carved in his memory, because Rome never saw him as someone worth remembering, only as someone worth watching for a time. And when the theater grew tiresome, when the curtains sagged and the laughter faded and the emperors moved on, they let the actor disappear. What they didn't see, what they never admitted, was this. Sporus was not weak. He had survived what no child should. He had endured mutilation, performance, humiliation. He had borne the weight of an empire's fantasy without ever once being asked who he truly was. But survival has limits, and when the pain of performance became greater than the fear of death, Sporus chose silence. Final, irreversible silence. The tragedy is not just that he died, it's that he never got to live. He was never a philosopher, never a poet, never a citizen with a voice in the forum. He was a stage prop, a relic, a memory etched into other men's desires. Even today, his story is told through the lens of others. Nero's bride, the castrated boy, the emperor's obsession. But who was he before that? Before the blade? Before the veil? Before the silence? We will never know. Because Sporus wasn't just erased from history. He was used by it. And when he finally said enough, no one listened. There is no tomb for Sporus. No stone with a name. No urn tucked away in a mausoleum. No grave for flowers or grief. Only silence. Even the historians who recorded his story, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, mention him only in fragments, never as a person, always as a side note, a symbol, a shadow, a boy who became a bride, a curiosity in the grotesque circus of Nero's reign. A name to provoke shock or laughter, nothing more. And then, nothing. He vanishes from the scrolls, not with a scream, not even with a whisper. Just gone. This is how history handles the inconvenient. It forgets them, not because their pain wasn't real, but because their pain was not profitable. There are statues of Nero still standing in museums, portraits, busts, coins bearing his face. But Sporus? Not a single image, not a fresco, not a carving on the side of a cup. Nothing. It's as if he never existed at all, except as a reflection of someone else's madness. And maybe that's the most tragic part. Sporus was never allowed to be himself. Not in life, not in death, not even in memory. Because every version of him that survives is tied to Nero's shadow. He is always the bride, never the boy. Always the eunuch, never the victim. Always Papaya's replacement, never a name in his own right. In fact, we don't even know his real name. Sporus was likely a nickname, or worse, a label. The Latin equivalent of a slur. Which means the only identity history left him with was the one imposed by his abuser. Think about that. A child mutilated, dressed up, renamed, then passed around like a ceremonial trophy. And in the end, all we remember is the role he was forced to play. Not the boy who might have loved books. Not the teen who may have once sung to himself in the dark. Not the man he never got to become. Just the doll. Just the mask. Just the silence. We often talk about monuments of memory. But what happens when there is no monument? No ashes to honor? No place to kneel? No name to speak? Does the pain disappear? Or does it simply sink deeper into the stone, into the cracks of time, until it becomes invisible? Sporus's life didn't end with violence. It ended with indifference. No court remembered him. No poet mourned him. No temple preserved his likeness. Even now, when his story is told, it is told as a footnote in Nero's madness, not as its own tragedy. And yet, in the shadow of that erasure, something still stirs. Because even if there is no statue, no portrait, no preserved relic, Sporus exists in the absence, in the empty spaces where his voice should be, in the gaps of Roman history where no one dared to look, in the theater where the curtain never closed. He is the missing line in a script that never allowed him to speak. He is the echo that lingers after applause fades. He is the soul that was never named and never buried. And maybe that's what makes his image more haunting than marble or bronze ever could, because it's incomplete, because it's broken, because it forces us to imagine what was taken and what was never returned. Picture this: a corridor in the Roman palace long after midnight. The torches have burned down to embers. The music has stopped. The guests have gone home. And in that silence, a single figure remains, standing before a mirror, not moving, not blinking, just staring, not at himself, but at the absence of himself, at a face he no longer recognizes, at a body sculpted by someone else's grief, at a soul that still breathes somehow, under the weight of silk and silence. That's the final image we have. Not a grave, not a shrine, but a mirror, cracked, warped, refusing to tell the truth. And behind it, the ghost of a boy no one tried to save. Sporus never asked to be remembered. He never delivered speeches in the Senate. He never led armies. He never wrote poetry. He was not powerful. He was not royal. He was not loud. And maybe that's why history felt it could forget him. Because history often chooses to remember those who take, not those who endure. But what happened to Sporus deserves more than footnotes. It deserves reflection. Because his life forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. Not just about Rome, but about ourselves. What makes someone human? Is it the body, the voice, the ability to say no? Or is it something deeper? A fire inside that flickers, even when the world covers it in silk and silence. Nero didn't just mutilate Sporus. He rewrote him. He gave him a new name, a new role, a new script, and expected him to smile through it all. We tell ourselves that was ancient history, that we've moved beyond it. But have we? Haven't we, even now, built systems that rename, reshape, and erase? Haven't we created roles people must perform just to survive? When a young person is told who they can be, what they must look like, how they must love, aren't we still dressing them in costumes sewn by someone else? When power demands obedience in exchange for affection, aren't we still standing in Nero's palace? When the only way to live is to disappear inside a mask, is that really living? Sporus' story is not about ancient Rome. It's about the cost of silence, the violence of pretending, the tragedy of being loved only when you stop being yourself. He was a boy, turned into a doll, called a bride, used as a memory. He was a victim of grief. But more than that, he was a victim of a world that could not love without possession. And that should frighten us, because it's easy to condemn Nero, easy to recoil at the castration, the wedding, the veil. But the real horror? No one stopped it. Not the priests, not the senators, not the poets. They watched, they laughed, they whispered. But no one said, "This is wrong." And so, the performance continued. Until Sporus could not. He wasn't killed in war, he wasn't executed for treason. He wasn't destroyed in a single act. He died by erosion, slow, invisible, complete. And in the end, he wasn't remembered for surviving. He was remembered for being used. I didn't expect to feel anything when I began researching Sporus. He was a name in a line of footnotes, just another figure swallowed by Rome's blood-soaked legacy. But somewhere between the veil and the silence, between the laughter of emperors and the absence of a grave, I felt it. That quiet ache, that terrible recognition of someone who was real and was never allowed to be. Sporus never wrote a single line, yet his life feels like a poem that ends mid-sentence. What strikes me most is not the horror of what was done to him, but the fact that no one called it horror, that his pain became spectacle, that his silence became a costume, that even today, we must dig through layers of myth and mockery just to hear his heartbeat. And so, I speak now not to the historians, but to the ones who've ever felt erased, to those told they must change to be loved, to those who've performed until they forgot their own voice, to those who've looked in the mirror and seen only what the world demanded to see. You are not alone. Sporus may not have had a grave, but he will have this: a story told, not as a joke, not as a tragedy of someone else's madness, but as a truth that demands to be witnessed. And perhaps that's all any of us really want, to be seen, not as the role we were given, but as who we truly are.